everyone. I'm Mac, as you may or may not know by now, and I'm going to be doing another series look today at the third place EULCS spring playoffs match between Fnatic and H2K. It's a 5 game series, so mostly I'm going to be talking about the draft and about some fairly basic points. I'm not going to be doing replay analysis because to do that just takes way too much time. The last series look I did was only 3 games, and I did one bit of replay analysis, and I mean it was like a 32-minute video. So if we're going to get through all the games, I want to keep it short. So this also gives you guys the ability to just kind of go AFK, and I'll go full podcast mode. You might want to take a look at the beginning of each game to see, just so you have like a visual representation of what the picks and bans are, so that it sticks better in your mind. But apart from that, you can pretty much just listen and be doing something else. So starting off, we'll talk about game 1, obviously, starting at the beginning. And looking at the bans, H2K is really prioritizing trying to keep Cly out, which is fair enough. He's a rookie. But at the same time, Trundle is always up, and in a tank meta, Trundle is pretty much always useful, especially if you're not going to be picking the Echo. So they first picked this Kindred, which is kind of dodgy. So the reason they're doing this is because Jankos is really uncomfortable on the Graves and the Nidalee is banned. So this is Fnatic giving them that option, being like, yo, we're going to ban Nidalee, because at the moment you have three top tier junglers. You've got Nidalee, you've got Kindred, and you've got Graves, because we're hella deep into the carry jungler meta. So this is them saying, okay, you can choose, and if not, then we'll pick away the Kindred. If you don't first pick Kindred, that is, we'll pick away the Kindred in first rotation, and you'll be stuck on Graves, and you suck with Graves. Or you can go down to one of the kind of B-tier junglers, like Elise or Gragas. So this is something that you actually see in all 5 games from H2K, which is prioritizing this Kindred, which I'm not sure if it was the right choice. Jankos performs okay in 3 of the games. Yeah, he does really well in games 3, 4, and 5, actually. But in games 1 and 2, he's pretty much a non-factor. So they give up the Echo Trundle as a first rotation from the red side, which is a big deal. And actually, this is a really odd series in that H2K picked blue side all 5 games, and Fnatic picked red side all 5 games. So this whole time, you're going to get a counter pick for Forbidden in every single game, which is also kind of questionable for me, because Forbidden's a pretty big part of Fnatic's success. They're not that side lane centric, because Reckless and Clyde tend to be a losing lane. Gamsu, I mean, we're in tank meta, so Gamsu's not going to be a massive deal in terms of being a carry threat, and Odoamne is probably better than him in terms of straight up laning against him. He does really well against him during this whole series, and even if he weren't, tank meta means that the differences between two players don't really show up that much in the top lane. So I'm not sure about the side selection for one thing. So after the second rotation, you get the Thresh takeaway from Cly, which again is, I mean, Fnatic kind of outplays this because, or H2K shoots himself in the foot, either way you want to look at it. I imagine they thought that Cly would default to the Thresh, but they just picked the Trundle straight away. And that leaves you on Thresh, which, fair enough, Vander's a really good Thresh, but Trundle just has much higher priority most of the time. And you look over in LCK, he's like 50% pick rate, and the rest of the time he's banned as far as I'm aware. And he's just so strong because he leeches so many stats from tanks, and that's something that we'll come back to later. So H2K carry on down the draft. You get Vander on Thresh, fine. You get Rio onto Maokai, okay. You don't really need to pick Maokai there, but I suppose... Well, you don't need to pick Maokai there because Echo's been locked in and Trundle's been locked in, so you know that the Echo is probably going top. It could be a flex to mid lane, so I suppose picking Maokai is fairly safe there. It's a safe pick, it doesn't reveal much about your draft. Fine. And they give Fnatic Graves. This is the problem with the Kindred, that Graves is... Spirit is just so comfortable on Graves. I feel like H2K might have actually been better banning out the Graves and first picking Kindred and putting Spirit on something else. He probably defaulted to Lee Sin, but fair enough. Kindred into Lee Sin's a pretty comfortable matchup. You get Forgiven on Callista and Rise, Ryu on Rise. Notice the champ. This is in the order they're locked in, not in who's playing them, because I want to be able to talk about the pick order. And the Rise pick's a really good pick here because normally you'd expect to see Lissandra on blue side, but seeing as Azir's not banned, then Azir's a really good counter matchup into Lissandra. So fair enough. You don't want to be playing Lissandra into Azir a lot of the time because as soon as you come out of your claw, he'll just knock you out, and it's really hard to make good engages. But looking at the team comps, you get a very distinct theme, and this is something that the casters didn't really touch on that I noticed almost immediately and was really worrying for me for H2K side. Is just look at the range disparity on these champions. You've got Kindred, who's pretty short range. You've got Thresh as your only real long range pick potential, or hard CC, but that's pretty unreliable in terms of you needing to land a hook. Okay, Vanda's really good with the hooks, but it's not hard engage. It's only this kind of one-man pick potential. And really, you only have 3 hard CCs plus the Callista throw-in for the Thresh. Maokai also really low range on his W. Rise, really low range. Callista, really low range. They have really low wave clear. You're going to pretty much be relying on Hurricanes on Callista and Kindred, and then Rise deleting waves for your entire wave clear. On the other hand, you look at Fnatic's comp, you have Echo, who has wave clear in the top lane. You have Trundle, who has a pillar and a slow. I mean, Echo has 3 slows as well, right? Which is ridiculous. I've mentioned this in the video before. If you want to hear my opinions on Echo's kit and the current meta, then head over and check that out. But so on Echo, you've got 3 slows. On Trundle, you've got another AoE slow. Echo's slows are 2 of them are AoE, 1 of them single target. Graves, you have an AoE slow, which is also a blind. Reckless, you're going to have, or Ezreal, you're going to have an AoE slow because he's going to build for Iceborne Gauntlet. And then Azir, you've got the wall. If he builds Rylai's, that's another slow, which is AoE, and he's got the ability to put up turrets. So with Azir's ulti, Trundle's pillar, Echo's W, his parallel convergence, and Graves' smokescreen, you have an obscene amount of zone control. And barring incredibly timed teleports, the chances of a Rise and a Callista and a Maokai ever being able to gap close on this team is just so low. The late game team fighting from Fnatic is really likely to just roll over H2K, and that's what we see in the game. Basically, as we get into the game, H2K's win condition is going to be crushing the 2v2 lane, right? Because Ezreal Trundle into Callista Thresh is going to be a massacre, straight up. You're just going to get pushed around all day. And the idea is that Jankos can then get in and do his counter jungling. So they really, really want standard lanes. And in the first game, they get them. They push in really hard on the top tower. They get a big CS advantage. They get the tower down really early, like 9 minutes, and it looks really good. But what H2K fails to do in this game is to press their early advantage. They keep playing around this top lane instead of going around to the bottom lane. And when you have a comp like this, which has really low wave clear and really bad ability to siege when playing into an Azir on one of the best stalling / late game teams in Europe, as I've talked about before, Fnatic are incredible at stalling out games, especially Febiven, and Azir being pretty much the best champion for that. You really need to be stacking dragons early so that you have the potential to make this team, which is incredible at kiting, check into you. If you have 5th dragon pressure, they have to come to you to fight, and that's when you can catch them with your double TPs. But that's not what H2K does. They keep playing around the top lane because the bottom, there's a lane swap which gets called by H2K, so you end up in Australia lanes with the AD carry support Joe in the top lane and the tanks top laners in the bottom lane. So the top tower goes down really early and they keep playing around that lane instead of using that pressure to push in the lane and then use teleports and minion wave pressure to get dragons. So they really need to start their dragon snowball early, and that's a big part of what loses in the game. The other part for me is that, what was I going to say? Right, yeah, sorry about that. I completely lost my head for a second. It's really late here. I've watched so many games today. I've watched all the Korean games, the SKT series against KT. I've watched the European series, and I've just watched the American series. I'm fresh off of that, so my brain's a bit muddled. Sorry if I pause a bit. Anyway, so instead of using, so you note that they have double TP advantage, right? That's hallmark. As soon as you see an Azir, you go, okay, we need to split up this map because Fnatic can only play on 2 lanes. Azir cannot be in 2 places at once. He cannot go and split push or be in a side lane, which is what Febiven is really good at doing. So we need to be using this double TP advantage to create plays, to create advantages on the map. Farm advantages, pressure advantages, and eventually turn those into objectives and or kills using your TPs. That's not what happens, and this is something that is really characteristic of Forgiven. Maybe it's not necessarily his fault, but it might be to do with him. Obviously, it's a team call where these people go, but throughout the entire game, Forgiven is just sat in the side lanes. They're constantly looking for that matchup, but as the game goes on, your Kalista needs to be grouping with the team because Kalista is being incentivized after recent nerfs for team fighting. So your Kalista and your Kindred should be holding the mid lane with their Hurricanes, and you should be having the Ryze, who by the mid game, because H2K actually have really good early game control, they have a couple K gold lead for a long time. They get to the really late game, but they don't capitalize on that early game snowball, and that's because they don't take any dragons and they don't use the Ryze to get into the side lanes and 1v1 people, because there was no one that could stand up to Ryze, no one, and they needed to do that. They don't even need to have anyone stand up to the Ryze because they have 2 teleports, so they should be using that. And I think Vander actually gets a Banner of Command, if I'm not mistaken, as well at some point. But you don't really notice the effect of it because they're not using the TPs properly. The TPs are very disjointed, and the whole thing is sloppy. What that leads to is Fnatic just completely outscaling them because you let an Ezreal and an Azir get to late game and they're just going to destroy you. Ezreal is one of those champions that can just, when it gets to 40 minutes into the game and he has all his items, just completely take over a team fight, and Azir is the exact same. Once you let this team get to late game, they will just destroy you in terms of the team fighting because you're going to be forced to check into them in various situations, and that's what happens. And they just, because their TPs aren't great, they can't close gaps on them. So, one more thing that I want to touch on is itemization, and there's a big no-no from Odoamne in this. He fixes it later on, I think, in the second game, but if there is a Trundle support on the enemy team, you need a QSS. He ends the game on Sunfire, Iceborne Gauntlet, Boots, Thornmail, Randuin's, and one other item, I think. Oh, Spirit Visage. But he really, really needed a QSS because as soon as Trundle ults you, the number of stats you lose all of your HP and a buttload of your resistances. The gold value you lose from that is just obscene, and it really shows later on in the game when Odoamne is in there soaking up the front line and Clyde pops ulti. Clyde becomes an unkillable monster, which is wrong for a support. He becomes so tanky because Odoamne is massive, and Odoamne just melts. Big mistake from him in terms of the itemization. He does fix it later, but I've got to call him out for that. He should know better. So that's game 1 down. And game 2 is weird. I'm not going to change the screen because nothing changes. It's the exact same draft, which again is very odd. I get the point of them being like, okay, so we didn't execute properly. The draft was fine, let's try it again. But the problem is that we've seen throughout the whole split that Fnatic is so good at scaling up. And they are really, really comfortable just playing for late game. And if you let them do that, they're going to do it over and over again. And Ezreal is one of Reckless's most comfortable champions. The other thing is that in the first game, like I said, they actually get standard lanes. And that's great. So they got pretty much the best start they could have got, because in standard lanes, Thresh Kalista should absolutely massacre Ezreal Cly, especially seeing as H2K's bot lane is probably, I would say, the second strongest, maybe kind of joint top with Mithy and Sven for being like the most incredibly mechanical and aggressive and oppressive bot lane, versus Fnatic's, which is kind of famed for losing, and they're on really crappy laning picks, Trundle and Ezreal should just get completely butchered in that matchup. So you got, in game 1, the best situation you could possibly get in the early game, and you still lost the game. Not only that, but the way the meta is right now and the way timings are with how late you get out the base nowadays and how early minions spawn mean that lane swaps are not really a sure thing anymore. It's a lot of the time it's a complete 50-50 and you just guess. Fnatic actually, pretty much every single game they look for a lane swap, and every single game they just run top and just hope for the best, and H2K calls it every game apart from the second one, I think. So maybe Fnatic need to switch that up, doing some, mind games where they just run bot and hide immediately. But so that's, in terms of the second game, repeating the draft again, that's kind of risky. If you took a 50-50 in the first game, got your gamble, and it didn't pay off, to then take the exact same gamble in the second game is, to me, kind of silly. And in the second game, it doesn't pay off because Fnatic get the lane swap and they beat the crap out of them in the lane swap. The lane swaps, well, they don't beat the crap out of them, but getting a lane swap with this team allows you to stall for the late game and allows that Ezreal to build up without being punished whatsoever, and allows you to pick really, really weak support picks like Trundle that don't really have a great laning phase into double range matchups. So, yeah, that was not great. I don't like the fact they repeated the comp. I see what they were doing, but I think that they really need to punish Fnatic's style much more, which they need to take them off these comfort picks, because if they did really well in the first game, you need to challenge them and say, okay, what else have you got? Because I mean, throughout IEM and through the season, Fnatic's been a team where they'll just repeat it if it's successful. They'll just do that. They're fine with that. And you need to take them off their comfort picks and ban them out, and then you start seeing weaknesses, like when they came back from IEM and people banned out the Jhin and the Lee Sin and they just choked for like 3 weeks. I'm going to do another video. I'm going to start a new series about lane swaps. I'm going to do another video on the second game lane swap because it was a really good example, so do watch out for that. But for the meantime, let's move on to the third game. So, Fnatic is up 2-0. It's game 3. It's looking great. They've been absolutely stomping. They've been allowed to play these super late game scaling comps, and they're just crushing with them because H2K has been doing really silly things, and the Kalista play from Forgiven in games 1 and 2 was really questionable. They gave Gamsu Echo as well, and he played amazing on that. And honestly, H2K just kept doing really rubbishy objective calls. They kept taking 50-50 smite fights when they didn't need to, instead of just peeling off Barons and engaging in 4v5s. Like, they chunk Spirit out, Spirit goes back, and then they take a 4v5 Baron and lose the smite fight eventually. I don't even know if Spirit smites it. I think actually a Fnatic member just auto-attacks it because Gamsu lands a really good stun onto Jankos and they blow him up. So, yeah. Something needs to change, and thankfully H2K recognises that. But Fnatic, this draft is, there's no other word for it, this draft is horrible. It's so bad, and it is, the word disrespect is thrown around a lot on the desk, and I completely agree that the disrespect here is unreal. So H2K makes the appropriate call. They ban out the Echo, they ban out the Azir. So Fnatic no longer has the crazy OP top lane matchup, which Gamsu is doing really, really well on, and they don't have the really annoying parallel convergence and the mad stuns and zone control, and they ban out the Azir as well. So they don't have that ability to stall super hard for the late game. They carry on first picking the Kindred. Fine, I guess. You give Graves over to Spirit. Maybe you didn't think Spirit was that big of a deal, although I'd kind of beg to differ. He actually gets Graves 5 games out of 5, which is just... I mean, if someone is super comfortable, like we know Spirit has been absolutely spamming this Graves pick, and it's like his favourite thing to play in the jungle, I feel like H2K should maybe have taken him off it at least once in the series and see if there's anything else. So the Kindred lock goes through, and then we get Braum Ezreal lock-in for the first pick. And this is just horrible. This is just saying, please punish us. A, Braum Ezreal is a really weak lane, and B, it tells you exactly what they're going to do. It tells you that they're going to stall for the late game. It reveals everything. You know that Spirit's going to come in with Graves. So pretty much in the first round of the draft, you've already given away 3 of your picks, which is just crazy. The comp is just bad. So they get Alistar and Maokai. Fine. Like, there's no need to pick the Braum for the first in the first round of the draft, and this is why. Because H2K didn't ban Alistar or Braum, and Thresh is up, and Trundle is up, there is no support priority here. You are pretty much just fine getting either way. There are so many power picks up. Poppy is up, Sivir is up, just everything is up. Maokai is up, Corki is up, Lissandra is up, Graves is up. Just there are so many other better picks, and the lack of focus on Sivir is really odd in this series. I think Sivir is just so much better at doing everything than Ezreal, and especially when you look at how well Fnatic did in the lane swap in the second game and how lane swap centric this meta is. Sivir just has a better laning phase, is way better at lane swaps, is way better at pushing towers, and gives you really decent wave clear. And you have to assume that if you ban the Ryze in this game, then Ryu is probably going to default, and seeing as Azir is banned, then Ryu's probably going to go for the Lissandra. He's an incredible Lissandra player, and the counter pick is gone. And Fnatic in this game actually just leaves himself with nothing to counterpick this Lissandra with. Corki is gone because H2K has picked it. Lissandra's up, and because you've got Ezreal and Graves as your only two damage sources so far, you can't pick a physical counterpick. You can't pick a Varus, for example, which does pretty well into Lissandra. You can't pick Jace, which Forbidden is great on. There's just no option from here. And the reason this comp is such a disrespect is because it has no wave clear. If you had a Sivir, then that wouldn't be such a big problem, because Sivir is incredible at wave clear. The comp also really doesn't have that much of an identity. Like, Braum wants to go forward, Ezreal's kind of kiting, Gragas is just a big frontline tank that's going to displace a lot of people, Graves is going to do a wombo, and Kassadin wants to go forward and assassinate people. Like, this team is pulling in a lot of different directions and doesn't really seem to have anything that is good at. Like, yeah, it's okay at team fighting, yeah, it's okay at making picks, yeah, it's okay at split pushing. But if you're going to play a double TP comp, which is fine, play a 1-3-1 comp, you need to have wave clear in your mid lane. And Ezreal, Braum can't really do that. I mean, Braum stops a decent amount of poke and enemy wave clear, but just Sivir would have been so much better here, especially for if you're going to pop Sivir ulti and then go in with Kassadin and Gragas for the hard engage. And especially seeing as they have Maokai, Alistar, it's just... A, first round drafting in Ezreal is awful, and it's just should never be repeated again. And B, there were just other better picks. They could have taken Corki, and that would have allowed them to anticipate the Lissandra pick and pick a Varus late game. Not late game, Varus in their 5th rotation and go for a poke comp, and that would have been great. Trundle was also up. Just, for me personally, I really like Trundle Corki as a red side first rotation because it gives you so much ability to flex. You can last pick your top laner, you can last pick your AD carry, you can last pick your mid laner. You have like 4 flex picks there, so you can get to the very end of the draft and they can still not know where one of your picks or 2 of your picks are going, which is a great strength. So I would have liked to see them pick Trundle Corki, or at the very least Sivir Maokai, just for simplicity's sake in the first round of the draft. But yeah, this is just super disrespect. They have no wave clear, they're trying to scale, and if you're playing a 1-3-1 comp and you get behind and you have no wave clear, you're just going to get battered. When you're playing 1-3-1 like this, you need to be able to exert pressure everywhere on the map at all points, including in mid lane, and you're not going to be able to do that against Corki Lissandra. So just this draft was just horrible, and there's not much else to say about this. So let's move on to the next game. So next game we have a much more balanced draft, and finally someone has picked Sivir. Holy crap, it took long enough. The draft in this game is really balanced. I kind of prefer H2K's just because it has a really strong theme to the composition. The Sivir pops ulti and everyone just goes ham, and Ryze can get defended with the Kindred ult and the Braum from the Graves and the Corki. But the Cassiopeia pick into the Ryze is also great. The thing about this game is that it wasn't really the draft or even the macro play, which hurts me to say, that affected it that much. It was honestly a lot of it was down to mechanics, and a lot of it was down to just overextensions, which it is a macro thing in terms of positioning, but not in terms of the team calls and intelligent stuff. Firstly, Gamsu was just overextending all game. He lets himself get killed by Jankos for first blood, and that gets him into the game. I mean, H2K played really well, don't get me wrong, but they really gifted this one. I don't know if it was just that the third game threw them, but this was, yeah, it was bad from Gamsu. By 20 minutes, I think there were 6 kills and 6 kills for H2K, and 5 of those were on Gamsu. Like down the board, everyone else was like 0 deaths, and Gamsu had 5, and it was terrible. There were a lot of mechanical misplays, a lot of almost disrespectful mechanical misplays from Cly and from Forbiven. Forbiven was trying to do flash ulties. He should be ult flashing because you can do that on Cassiopeia, but he was trying to do it straight from the front against all these really good players who have really, really good reaction times and will flash it, will get away from it. And the same thing goes for Cly. I mean, a couple of the ultis he just straight up missed, or people like turned their backs on them. So, I mean, props to H2K again, but they weren't great. Cly did the same thing. He was like flash W queuing onto Forgiven just from vision, straight up head on, and Forgiven's on Sivir, and he's just going to spell shield it. This is a guy who is renowned for being one of the best reactionary players in the whole of League of Legends. Like, people talk about Forgiven and they're like, no, Forgiven doesn't anticipate skill shots. He reacts to them in the time between them leaving the person who cast them and them arriving at him. His reaction speed is just incredibly quick. So to come straight like head on, run at him and just try and do a solo queue flash headbutt pulverize initiate is not going to work. So all in all, it was just not a good game for Fnatic, and there honestly really isn't much to say about the kind of macro element of it. H2K played it out well. They got a strong early game lead and they just snowballed the crap out of it. You get Ryze ahead, you get Jankos ahead, and Fnatic just misplayed the team fights and got rolled over. There's really not much else to say, unfortunately. So we're going to move on to game 5 now, and let's take a look at this 1 second. So, moving into the final game, we have pretty much the same ban setup again, except that Fnatic has banned out Lissandra, which I agree with. I don't think Rhea was that threatening on the Rise. I don't really see the need to ban it out, which they did before, and it kind of blew up in their face. Take Rhea off the Lissandra. Rhea was such a big element of the team's shot calling and its engages, and did so well on that pick that I think it makes sense to put him on a champion where he can't have that kind of playmaking impact. Yes, Ryze can do obscene amounts of damage, but he needs the team to make the initiates for him. So that's a good ban in my eyes. Again, we see them locking in the first pick Kindred, and Fnatic's first rotation is Maokai Trundle. I'm not 100% sure on this because I feel like if you get Trundle, then Maokai is deprioritized, and also there are so many top laners left up. Like, there's Poppy left up, so if you get Maokai Trundle, you give away the flex. Trundle's no longer a flex. You know where the support is going, so they can pick a good bot lane into you. They can counter you pretty easily, or they can not counter you because Trundle doesn't really hard counter that many people. They know you're going to have a weak bot lane matchup, especially seeing as you've been picking this Ezreal all day. So they can just play around that. It's been working out for them, but that's because they've not been getting punished in the early game. And by this point, it's down to the wire. You know, you can't rely on stuff that's been working or that worked in the first 2 games to work in all the games. So H2K gets the Poppy and the Ryze, and I'm not sure about the Ryze pick this early. Maybe they didn't want to give it to Fnatic, but I feel like you could pick a support here. Maybe they wanted to see more. They probably wanted to just counterpick the bot lane in the jungle, but it's fairly safe to assume that Spirit's going to pick up Graves and that Reckless is going to be on either Sivir or Ezreal, so Brown would have been a completely fine lock in there. I don't have much else to say about that. So we get the same exact rotation from Reckless and Spirit again. Again, I would prefer Sivir here. I think Sivir goes much better with the Maokai, much better with the Trundle going in. Ezreal has been working, but only because they've not been getting punished in the early game, like I've said, and because they got a good lane swap in game 2, but game 3 and 4 they got battered pretty hard. And then we finally get Corki Brown and Orianna. The Pick of Orianna, I'm not sure about. Febiven actually does really well on it, which is a big part of why this game goes so well. If you look at the replay, pretty much the whole game, Febiven actually has roam priority over Ryu. He's really battering him in the mid lane. At one point, he's up a lot of CS. It's like 20 or 30. So, yeah, the Orianna worked out really well. I wasn't quite sure of it. Maybe go for the Cassiopeia instead, but that's not been working out. So I see why they'd go for the Orianna. Maybe I would have preferred to see something else, like a Twisted Fate could have been the option here as well. I think Twisted Fate, Sivir is an incredible comp to play. It just gives you so much pick potential, especially when playing into a Rise and Jankos' Kindred, who's been out of position a lot of times. But again, this game doesn't really come down to the macro decision making that much. H2K, it's pretty much the same story as it has been for the whole series. H2K plays really well in the early game, but they don't prioritize enough stuff. They keep taking 50-50s on objectives. They're not prioritizing their 1-3-1 split push approach. Forgiven still doing a lot of side farming, and Fnatic isn't punished enough for their weak early game and their weak bot lane. I mean, Ezreal Trundle is just appallingly weak. It's such a just free bot lane. You can do whatever you like. But what it comes down to is the late game team fights. They let them scale up, and eventually Fnatic get one good team fight, and that completely ends the game. And that makes me want to talk just briefly about a fairly annoying note about the way the game is balanced at the moment in the current meta. And first of all is that how much the meta suits Fnatic, tank top and being able to play passive. And the reason you can play so passive is that, yeah, H2K could have done a better job of snowballing out the early game, but there's only a certain extent to which that helps. And I think that there needs to be more diversity in the early phases of the game, and I think the way to promote that is by potentially buffing the Rift Herald and buffing the Dragon. Maybe give the Dragon some gold back on it, not as much as before, but some global gold, because then teams would actually have to fight over the Dragon, or you would get snowballed on. But at the moment, Rift Herald isn't that strong. Like, it's good if you can use it, but there are counters to it in the lane phase if you know what you're doing, if you're getting lane swapped on. And the Dragon, you don't really need to fight it until like the 4th stack. You can just happily sit there and scale up and then take a team fight. And the problem is really exacerbated by the fact that in the mid game, death time is just so long. Actually, Fnatic ends up taking one team fight after being really far behind. I thought they were going to lose this game for the majority of it. H2K were looking good, they were playing well, they were doing slightly better than before in terms of their objective focus, and their TPs were looking more coordinated. Odoamne was having a really good game on Poppy. Forgiven's Corki was decent. Ryu was beasting it on Rise. And they just, to make one team fight mistake, Ryu steps out too forwards. Jankos' positioning is really off. He goes all the way around the side and is completely absent from the fight. He's not able to use his Kindred ulti on Ryu. And Fnatic take a team fight. And at 35 minutes, the mid lane outer is still up. So they take mid lane outer, they take mid lane inner, they take the inhibitor turret, they take the inhibitor, they take 2 Nexus turrets and the Nexus. That's 5 turrets plus a Nexus, which is like, let me count this, about 17,500 hit points worth of structures at 35 minutes, all in one run, just from one team fight win, which they actually win at the outer turret. So the death time is, something needs to change with the way that teams are being rewarded for just being weak as hell in the early game and scaling up. Because the fact that Fnatic has been able to get away with losing most of the first Rift Heralds, most of the first 3 Dragons, a lot of Barons, and then still winning the game with losing lanes at 35 minutes is really wrong to me. And I think that, like I said, there needs to be buffs to Rift Herald and to Dragon, and there need to be changes to the way that death timers scale into the late game, because it really is silly, which is a bit of a sad note. Hopefully that will be fixed before the mid-season invitational, or at least the next season. That would be great. that is going to be all for today on kind of my take on the Fnatic versus H2K series. Much less draft focused today, and in all honesty, the last 3 games were just decided by poor team fighting. The first 2 games were much more interesting. If you're going to watch 2 games, I would suggest you watch those because the last 3 aren't that great. They're more just misplays and the game being handed to them rather than interesting stuff going on. I am going to be doing a video about the second game on lane swaps because it was a fantastic lane swap to learn from. So please do look out for that. And if you enjoyed the video, enjoyed listening to me talk for a while, then please do like and subscribe. And I would love it if you could leave feedback because this is as much a learning experience for me as it is for anyone who's watching these videos to learn. So thank you very much for watching, and please do take care of yourselves. Bye bye.